Okay, the last topic I want to talk about, or the second video, I want to, in 5.1, is something called inverse functions. So we left off the previous video talking about one-to-one functions. One of the purposes of determining whether it's a one-to-one function, if you have a one-to-one function, you will have an inverse function. So in a minute we're going to talk about how to come up with inverse functions. But if you're given a relationship and you determine it's a function, and then you also determine it's a one-to-one function, then you know there is an inverse function. If it is not a one-to-one function, then there is no inverse function. So a few definitions. Obviously, this is the typical indication of a function f of x. You know how they designate if something is an inverse function? Trying to make it very clear. F to the negative 1 of x. Now please, do not think of this as an exponent. It's not like f to the minus 1. This is just simply here as a symbol of an inverse function. Let me give you a brief definition. An inverse function reverses or undoes what the function did. So for example, let me give you an easy example. Let's take an equation. I give you this. If we were to check it out, this is a one-to-one function. In the next video, we're going to tell you if you're given a function, one-to-one function as an equation, we're going to tell you the method to determine the inverse function. But for now, let me just give you the inverse function. Turns out it's 1/2 x minus 1. But here's what I want to show you. I want to show you an example of how the inverse function reverses what the function did. In other words, let's start with x equals 3. And we're going to put it in the function. So when you put 3 in for x, that's 6 plus 2. F of x equals 8. So the function takes the value of 3 for x, produces 8. Now just for fun, let's take the value we got out of the function. Let's put 8 into the inverse function. Just to make it clear. So 1/2 times x, x is 8. So I'm sticking 8 into my inverse function, minus 1. 8 times 1/2 is 4. 4 minus 1 is 3. And look what happened. When we started up here with the original function, We said let x equals 3. The function gives us an 8. If I take that 8, plug it into the inverse function, what does it give me? A 3. Back to where I started. This inverse function just reversed or undid what the function did. So that's the idea about an inverse function. Now real quick, for the 3 different possible types of functions, let me tell you how to figure out the inverse. First one, if you have a one-to-one function of ordered pairs, this is very simple. Let's just say set A is we'll call it a function f of x. We'll keep it simple. We'll just have 3. First of all, is this relationship a function? Do the x's repeat? They do not repeat. It is a function. Is it a one-to-one function? Do the y's repeat? They do not. This is a one-to-one function. So then they say, okay, please come up with the inverse function. Very simple. To get the inverse function of ordered pairs, you simply swap x and y. So 1, 2 becomes 2, 1. 2, 5 becomes 5, 2. 3, 10. Very straightforward. That's all you have to do. If you're given a graph of a function, and it's a one-to-one function, how could you determine the inverse function? I actually created a graph here. Let me tell you what you do, then I'll show it to you. You take your original function, the graph of it, and you reflect it around the line x equals y. What does that mean? Let me show you this graph. This straight line, diagonal line, it's a line x equals y. This is my original function. It's sort of the darker, thicker line. What you have to do is, if you can imagine this line right here, you take this graph and you sort of flip it. And when you flip it, what you end up with is the inverse function. So hopefully you can sort of visualize, if you take this graph and you rotate it around this diagonal line, and when you do that, this is now your inverse function. Okay, so I think on the homework, they may give you some graphs and they ask you to figure out the inverse function. Not too difficult. Now the third thing is, if you're given an equation, sort of like the example I did, if you're given an equation like this and it's a one-to-one function, then how do you figure out the inverse function? Here I just gave it to you, but we need to know how to actually determine this inverse function. And that's actually going to be on a video I've already created, so I'm not going to go over that again now. I will just have you look at the next video and we'll go through the steps to determine the inverse function. All right, that's it for now.